Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 21st of July. Today we're mainly going to be focusing on the Zaporizhia front, but we're also going to be talking about Klishchiivka because there are some pretty significant changes to the map all across the board. Let's begin by looking at Counterattack, and if you zoom in on my map, you'll notice that I've added in some gray zones in between the Russian and Ukrainian lines, which is something that I'm going to continue doing over the next few days, just to ensure that the map is as accurate as possible so you get a very accurate understanding of both sides' forward positions. But anyway, in terms of the Ukrainian advances in this direction, the Ukrainians have been able to expand their zone of control to the west of Lobkove. Lobkove is a town over here, which is under Ukrainian control, but the gray zone is very close to the Ukrainian positions in Lobkove because of the nature of this entire area, because really all of the surrounding fields around Lobkove are on a valley, so it is very difficult for the Ukrainians to advance or for the Russians to even counterattack. This is all a very low elevated area, but the Ukrainians over the past 24 hours, or even before that, they were able to expand their zone of control to the current blue line that you see. And so they perhaps advanced zero point 0.4 miles at a certain area. But what's the most significant about their gains? And I'm going to map the full extent of their gains that I'm referring to. You can see it over here. It looks something like this. But what's the most important thing about the Ukrainian gains in this direction is that they were able to enter the town of Kamyanske from the southwestern flank. So this was done by advancing through this one road that leads from Lobkove into Kamyanske. And for a certain period of time, the Ukrainians actually had the front line at this position over here where I have the lines mapped out. So they did have control over a good chunk of this southern portion of Kamyanske, which includes several houses and a few blocks, and it's very close to some warehouses. So the entire threat would be that the Ukrainians are attacking some very strong Russian fortified positions in Kamyanske. It's really the Russian vanguard, really adjacent to the Dnieper River, or what remains of the reservoir, was Kamyanske. So the Russians do have a lot of resources set up within the town of Kamyanske. They did try advancing here a couple of months ago, and now the dividing line is really along this specific river that I'm going to zoom in on. I'm not sure what it's called, but there's this very minor river, and that's where you can see the division between the Russian and Ukrainian lines. And so you have a large contingent of Russian forces and equipment that's sort of exposed now because the Ukrainians have been able to push from the south, and there is an opportunity for the Ukrainians to flank them, and that could leave some Russians isolated. So the Russians, they caught on to this Ukrainian maneuver from Lobkove, and over the past 24 hours, they've conducted some localized counterattacks. Perhaps they advanced maybe 0.3 miles and retook some of the houses which the Ukrainians had under their control. And so I'll just show on a square generally what the Russians were able to retake. It looks something like this. So you can see there's some pretty significant fighting going on for the town of Kamyanske, which is something that we did not see before. Kamyanske has really not experienced the sort of fighting that we saw at Piatikatki, for example, or at a place like Robotyne, which I'm going to right now. In Robotyne, the situation is actually starting to cool down a little. We saw for really 45, 46 days now these very strong Ukrainian assaults from their 10th Army Corps, from some of their new units that have been trained by NATO countries like 47th Brigade, 65th Brigade, 33rd Brigade. Those are just some of the units that have been involved. Those are the three main units, I would say. There's a lot of other Ukrainian units from the 10th Army Corps and from outside of it that are involved with the counteroffensive in the Orkiv sector, but they have not played as crucial of a role in terms of them sending their infantry fighting vehicles to the front line, trying to pass through nature reserves and through open fields. That's really been up to those three brigades that I previously mentioned. So what we're seeing now is reports that the fighting is beginning to die down. There were still Ukrainian attacks directly to the north of Robotyne, trying to attack some of the fortified positions of the 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment. Motorized Rifle Regiment. And for now, we have not seen any significant breakthroughs into Robotyne, despite the fact that the Ukrainians have been attempting to attack from multiple different axes over a extended period of time. First, we saw from the northwest, then we saw from the northeast. Now we're seeing more of it from just the north directly along that highway that you could see highlighted in yellow, but none of it's really working out. So for now, the fighting's beginning to die down. But I do expect Ukraine to receive reinforcements. The Ukrainians do still have reinforcements. Don't believe that Ukraine's running out of men just yet. They do have the 10th Army Corps, which was formed. I've talked about it before. Before the counteroffensive started, it was estimated that they had 20 to 30,000 men. Most of those men are still combat capable, and a lot of them have not seen fighting yet. And so you could see some of those individuals within that unit being sent and being used to beef up some of these units like the 47th Brigade, which has undoubtedly suffered extreme losses. That's just the nature of the fighting over here. I don't have exact numbers. I would be lying if I gave an exact number. But just think of it. If you're within one of these companies from the 47th Brigade and every single day you're day in, day out assaulting same positions and there's no change to the map, then it's not really unlikely to assume that your company is suffering very high casualties, especially with the circumstances with these open fields, these minefields that are laid everywhere, the field day that the artillery is having because of the fact that the elevation is relatively low in a lot of the areas that Ukraine has talked about. We see that on the elevation map. So it does make sense now that the fighting is beginning to die down as Ukraine, with these three forward units that have been assaulting Robotyne, are beginning to experience pretty high losses. So I do expect reinforcements. Speaking of reinforcements, actually, the 128th Mounted Assault Brigade, they sent some of their units to reinforce the Piatikatki town. I'm basically marking it as under Ukrainian control at this point. And they also do have some forces on the Orikhiv sector, so it's sort of split. So again, for now, decreasing fighting. Where we're seeing increasing fighting is around the Storomayorske, Velyka Novosilka, whatever you call it. A lot of people call it the Vermivsky Ledge, this entire sector of the fighting around really the border between Zaporizhia and Donetsk Oblasts. And if you've been watching the previous videos, you've been hearing me talk about how the Ukrainians have really approached Pripyat from the north directly, and they've established positions in some of the hedgerows that are directly to the north of it, with not large squads like 40 maximum men in some of these hedgerows, but they're so close to Pripyat that you could have small arms firefights occurring between the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers. But it seems like the Russians have now understood the threat that's posed by that, and they've launched their own counterattack a bit to the east of Pripyat. And originally the line was generally around here where, you know, Storomayorske was sort of a bulging out on the terms of the Russian line, so the Russian line was bulging out at Storomayorske. Now the Russians have sort of evened it out by advancing, let's look at the distances, advancing 1.3 miles, 1.4 miles maximum, certain areas nearly 2 miles. And what they did was they reached this nature reserve that we talked about before, the Hrusheva Nature Reserve. And that nature reserve, it spans this entire area. I'll mark it with a square. It's like all of these squares around here, that's where the nature reserve is located. You have ponds, you have lakes, you have, different forestry, bushes, and stuff like that. So it's a good area for concealment for small groups that are trying to break through and, go from one field to the next. So the Russians, they've been able to, first of all, take this line over here, this hedgerow line over here, and then reach the nature reserve itself and take up positions in some of the hedgerows that are running through directly to the south of the ponds over there. So now you're seeing the Russians establish this 1 mile, 2 mile buffer to the north of Pripyat, which will prevent flanking of Pripyat, but they still need to deal with the threat of Ukrainians attacking Pripyat directly, because you do still have this Ukrainian contingent, which is pretty close to Pripyat. It's even hard to measure it with the measuring stick because the numbers are so small, because the difference between Pripyat and the gray zone is like 0.3 miles. But you could see that the Russians now have this opportunity to flank the Ukrainian forces, so we're going to have to see if they go through that, because now they do have sort of this advantage where they're a bit to the north. The elevation is pretty similar, so that's not necessarily an issue in that area, but it does give the Russians an opportunity to flank the attacking Ukrainian forces. Then going to the east of Storomayorske, in the last video I talked about how it was pretty likely, based on reports from both Ukrainian and Russian sources, that Staromayorsk was contested in the northwest. But since then, it seems like the Russians have conducted a localized counterattack, pushed the Ukrainians out of the road that they were advancing through, this road that is from Makarivka into Staromayorsk, which passes through these warehouses and then through some of the warehouses in the northwestern part of Staromayorsk. So now Staromayorsk is fully under Russian control again. Now, moving on to the situation in Vuhledar, which is an area that I've seldom discussed over the past several months. Last time that I discussed it in depth was probably February, because the Russian second offensive, there was the first offensive by the Russians in November, and the second offensive started late January, ended mid-February, and that was unsuccessful. And so since then, the Ukrainians have really made Vuhledar into this important military cluster, which houses a lot of their forces. There's some barracks over here, and they have some great positions to take refuge in that have still not been destroyed. You have all these apartment buildings. Most of them have not been leveled. Some of them, from the footage we saw in February, did experience damage, but really the skeleton of the structures is still strong. And so you have a lot of forces, especially from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade stationed over here, and they have their respective artillery crews. So what we saw today is that there was a Ukrainian attempt at probing the line, and this was a probing attack. It was not an offensive or an attempt at an offensive from what I interpreted of the situation. But they launched this attack starting out from the 00532 road, which is over here, and then they tried advancing through some of these open fields in the direction of Russian positions in Mikhailsk. Now, this attack was broken up pretty quickly by Russian artillery crews, and from the ground itself, there was a lot of mines that were scattered over there, and their units responsible for defending were the 36th Separate Guards Water Rifle Brigade and the 155th Marine Brigade. This unit over here, which is really infamous for its high casualties in Pavlivka, which were over exaggerated, but it did fight very hard in Pavlivka and then attempted to go into Vuhledar, although unsuccessfully. Now, there's footage to back up what I just claimed. There was a Ukrainian column, not a large column by any means, but there were some BMP2s, there were some T-64s. In terms of the specific amount that were lost, at least visually confirmed, there were 3 T-64 BV tanks and 2 BMP2 infantry fighting vehicles that were destroyed. And the fact that we have the BMP2s there indicates that the Ukrainians wanted to drop off forces, and then this would be a pretty small squad, but they would be moved into Mikhailsk itself to try to gauge the defenses of the Russians to see how strong they are. Because think of it, Vuhledar is relatively close to Staromayorsk in terms of the fact that they're all on the southern front. So it makes sense if the Ukrainians are trying to expand the Zaporizhia counteroffensive to a new sector in order to perhaps find a new weak point from which they can, sort of exacerbate their gains and start a chain reaction where they advance in one area, it divides the Russian forces, and they can continue pressing in that specific direction. Because when we were talking about the probing attacks that the Ukrainians initially launched in the beginning of June before the counteroffensive, those were around, Staromayorsk, those were around Robotyne, Orikhiv. I didn't really hear anything about Vuhledar. Maybe they should have done that. And it seems like now they are, but it seems like the Russians do have prepared defense over here because they were able to prevent any sort of breakthrough by the Ukrainians. Now, moving a bit to the north, we're going to talk about some minor Russian gains around the northern flank of Avdiivka. The Russians advanced perhaps 0.4 miles at most adjacent to this small pond over here, this one that I'm going over with this square. So they did advance towards the dachas in northern Avdiivka, and they also advanced to the west of Kamyanka, where they do have positions that they took over after very fierce fighting. They advanced from this pond just to the west of Kamyanka to some of the hedgerows over here, so that's about a 0.5 mile advance. Again, nothing significant. The Russians are still engaging in positional battles over here in order to secure the northern flank and try to actually cut off the supply lines into Avdiivka. And if you look at my map, I do have the rail lines going through Avdiivka mapped. Those are not being used, obviously, but these roads over here, look through them, you'll see all of the different routes that are used to supply Avdiivka. Now, going to the north, the Klishchiivka, this is an area where there are some, ambiguities, I would say. And I talked about this in my last video, but it does seem like the Ukrainians have shifted the line more to the east than I initially expected, because I was saying in my last video that the Russians were holding their positions in the forested area to the west of Klishchiivka. Klishchiivka is over here. The forested areas I was talking about are over here, and then a bit to the north over here. So I've adjusted the map upon looking at further reports and just further evidence from the ground itself. It does seem like the Ukrainians have been able to advance from their fortified positions over here around these hedgerows to the next line, which means that they were able to secure the fields in between. So that's an advance of maybe 0.4 miles at that area and then 0.9 miles at the northern part. So what this means is that the Ukrainians are now sending their forward squadrons, and these are very small units, by the way, from the 3rd Assault Brigade and the 5th Assault Regiment. Those are the 2 units doing this, but they're the ones that are moving in their forces in small numbers, so they are being met, obviously, with pretty similar Russian resistance. The difference is that the Ukrainians are allowed and they are able to do regular troop rotations in this area. And this is an issue that I've seen mentioned also by the Russian side, is that the Russian forces defending Klishchiivka do not have the same ability to conduct troop rotations due to the fact that they don't have that many men on the rear around Klishchiivka to be sent in to defend it. So the same sort of men are being utilized in its defense, which is wearing them down. And what makes it even worse is that the Ukrainians are now assaulting Andriivka. Andriivka is one of the towns that's supplying Klishchiivka from the south. There's a road that goes from Andriivka into Klishchiivka, and that's very important for Russia's supply lines in their southern flank. The Ukrainians have been able to advance, since my last video, about 0.6 miles towards Andriivka. They took over a fortified area in between the last front line and Andriivka, so now they're really close to the town itself, about 0.5 miles away. So they're about 0.5 miles away. Once they reach it, the Ukrainians will be able to control the southern flank, and they'll be able to fire onto the different supply lines that are feeding into Klishchiivka directly from the east. So all of these supply lines that are coming in from here, from here, from here, the Ukrainians have control of the heights overlooking them, because they already secured the heights to the west in the battles that we've been covering over the past 2 or 3 weeks. So they have control of this elevation 750 feet above sea level versus Klishchiivka, which is 500 feet above sea level. And then all of the fields that the Russians are using to supply Klishchiivka and to send reinforcements, which are needed, as we talked before about the troop rotations, from the east, through all of those roads, through those open fields. Those are also on a very similar elevation to Klishchiivka. And so the Ukrainians are going to begin moving in their shorter range artillery guns across the canal to this area and begin firing onto the Russian forces that are trying to resupply the Klishchiivka garrison. And that's what makes it so difficult to defend Klishchiivka. So from a Russian perspective, the best thing to do right now is first of all to prevent the fall of Andriivka and then to hold on to this northern height. Some maps I've seen say that this northern height over here, where we talked about in the last video, 215.7, is already contested, if not controlled by the Ukrainians. I still dispute this. What we saw from drone footage is that this height was shelled extensively by the Russians, is that the Ukrainian assaults towards it have failed from everything we've seen on the ground. So it seems like the Russians still hold on to it. They need to hold on to it if they want to continue holding on to Klishchiivka in general. Let's look at the actual elevation from Klishchiivka. So here you see the Ukrainian heights. They're already pushing into the town itself. They're not in it yet. As I said before, they're in the forested area, which is not important in terms of elevation, but it's a very good area for concealment from Russian artillery strikes, for example. And then Andriivka. Andriivka is actually on the heights, and so Russians do have an advantage by holding on to it. It could protect their positions on the Klishchiivka Valley. But if the Ukrainians, which we're seeing them do right now, continue pushing into this box and take it over, and that elevation would also be nullified for the Russians. No longer will they have that advantage, and neither will they have the northern advantage if the northern trench system is taken over by the Ukrainians. And then look at all the roads that are leading into Klishchiivka. there aren't that many paved roads that are going in. The ones that are, they're very, very small. There's not many of them. And then there's all of these just fields, and you can see the elevation. Look at the elevation for them. Like, I'll just click on one. You can see 500 feet, even less. Here it's a bit more, 550 feet. So you could see the difference in the topography, the height advantage that the Ukrainians have. If the Ukrainians want to be supplying, or the Russians want to be supplying their positions over here, then they really need to get serious about defending the flanks. So we're going to have to see what ends up occurring in that regard. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.